Hey friend, Colin here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to mix a fat snare drum. We're going to be looking at getting a fat snare drum sound today using just limiting, EQ, and compression. And this is going to help you make sure you can get a big sound out of your snare drum that sits consistently in your mix. But before we dive in here, if you're looking to dial in a repeatable workflow for cranking out professional sounding drum mixes, then you need to go through my 3-step framework for mixing drums workshop. This workshop is going to walk you through the 3-step process that I go through on almost every single one of my drum mixes to help you get professional sounding drum mixes right from your home studio. It is a 100% free to watch, on-demand video training, and you can get instant access to that by clicking the link below in the video description. Now let's jump in here and take a look at these drums here. Let me hit play and show you where the mix is sitting at the moment, and you can hear the drums inside the mix, and then we'll take it a level deeper and I'll solo up the drums as well as just the snare drum for you on this track. So here's our finished mix for this song. You can hear our snare drum's carrying a lot of weight with it. It creates quite the big impact as it hits in this song, and it's quite a driving factor with the kick drum to propel this song forward and give it some weight and give it some guts behind it so it doesn't feel so gentle and so mellow all the way through here. So let me show you a before and after here on the snare drum. Here's where we started on our snare drum. You can see it's not like we're starting with a small or thin sounding snare drum. We start with quite a hefty sound on the snare drum, but we're controlling a couple of the elements here so it sits more consistently in our track. And we have that heavy hit all the way through on each one of these snare hits, and it doesn't come and go, and we don't have any of this nasty ringing going on with the bottom end that we generate here on our snare drum. So let's go piece by piece here and take a look at what we're doing. Usually the first thing I'm throwing in on drums is a limiter. If we zoom out here, you can see the snare drum isn't too dynamic. It doesn't move quite all over the place volume-wise, but there are a couple notes that jump out, and the limiter is in there to help us get that little extra level of evenness before we push into our EQ and our compression. So take a look here, and you can see how much reduction we're doing on the snare drum. So you can see for most of the song here as we're listening through on this final chorus, it's not doing any reduction here, but then we have some of these bigger hits here. I jumped back so you could see where the limiter jumps into action here, and it's only on the bigger hits here. So some of these snare hits that jump out and they're a little bit louder and have a bigger transient than the rest of the snare drum. That's where our limiter jumps into action to just tuck that transient back in and make sure it stays even with the rest of our drum. Moving into the next element here, this is where we're doing a little bit more work with our first EQ here. I'm going to turn these all off and you can hear what we're doing here. The first thing I'm pulling in is, of course, a high-pass filter here. I'm rolling it into about 138 hertz here. I want to control some of the bottom end on this snare drum. You hear how hefty it is, even by itself here, just the raw recorded snare drum. So I want to control some of that bottom end before we push into compression and before we try and emphasize that bottom end. Control before you boost here. So we're rolling in our high pass filter, 12 dB per octave slope here to 138 hertz. Take a listen to this. just tightening up the bottom end and controlling some of that more sub area that we don't really need in our snare drum. It doesn't need to be that heavy and it doesn't need to be that hefty. I don't want it to be fighting with our kick drum for dominance in the bottom end. I want our snare drum to sit just slightly above here with the fundamental around the 150 or 200 hertz area. Now, the next thing that's bothering me here on this snare drum, and it's probably bothering you here at this point now, is there's a little bit of ringing here in the low end and up towards the low mid area. At 182 hertz, there was a frequency that was ringing out. See if you can hear it here. I'm going to hit play, and then I'm going to click this notch in, and you can hear that ringing disappear, and our snare drum drastically cleans up in sound. So just finding that one ringing frequency that wasn't really in tune with the rest of the drum or with the rest of the kit as a whole. It doesn't ring nicely with the song. It's very out of place. So just notching that one ringing frequency out, that one nasty frequency, cleans up the snare drum immensely here by itself and even in the kit as a whole. So just that one frequency there, 182 hertz, pulling that out by about 18 and a half dB. And you can see our Q is all the way up here because we don't want to affect the frequencies around it. I just want to grab this one frequency that's ringing, that's poking out, and pull it down and reduce it here in the snare drum without affecting the area around it because we're very close to our fundamental here. Now, the next thing I'm doing before I'm doing these two boosts up here is I like to get my compressor in place here. So we've got the attack set at about 21 milliseconds here, and then our release is at about 76 here. The attack is a little bit faster than where I'd normally put it on kick or snare, but I wanted to pull it in. You can see the transients are a little bit sharper here on the snare drum, and especially on these bigger hits here. So I wanted to control some of that and keep our snare drum as even as possible, especially because I'm going to boost bottom end and try and get a fatter sound out of the snare drum. I don't want it moving all over the place, and I don't want large jumps in frequency change on the snare drum. So bringing our attack up in speed here a little bit helps to tame the snare drum transients so we can get a more even sound out of it. And then the release here is set so it's moving in time with the drum here. I'm going to hit play. We're going to be doing about 6 dB reduction here, and you can see how our reduction, you can see how the compressor moves in time with our snare drum. You can hear we're not ruining the attack by having our attack on the compressor up at about 20 milliseconds. We're actually leaving plenty of room for that initial transient to pop through and give us that sense of attack and that sense of impact on the snare drum. And then our compressor gets to work and makes sure the rest of the snare drum is even and we have consistent hits coming here from the drummer. It also tightens up our snare drum a little bit, so having our release set to work in time with the snare drum helps to tighten up the drum sound and give us a tighter drum kit sound overall here. So now we're going to go back and we're going to do our boosts here. So I want to boost top end into the compressor here before we go after and we boost bottom end post compression here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up some of that shimmer and some of that shine from the bottom snares here, some of that sizzle. We're up at about 9K here. I'm going to do about a 4 dB boost here. So take a listen. Just this almost 4 dB boost gives us that brightness and gives us that blast of air on the snare drum, and it helps you hear that release of the bottom snares on the drum, which is really, really nice. Makes it sound really beautiful here in this track. Now, the next thing we're doing is, if you were watching the frequency analyzer, we have kind of a dip here in the mid-range reaching up into the high mids. So at 1.75K, we're doing about an 8 dB boost here. So it's quite drastic, but you're going to hear how it fills out the snare drum sound and gets rid of this weird dip we have in the mid-range. Helps our snare drum feel more full range, so it's not kind of top end and bottom end here. We're not lacking any mid range. There's no dip in the frequency range on our snare drum. It stays pretty even across the board here from about 200 hertz up, and that's what we want on our snare drum. We want it to feel full range, so you feel that impact and you feel that attack when the drummer strikes the snare drum. Now that we've got our top end here, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to boost bottom end up on our snare drum. So an EQ post compression here. So once we've evened out our snare drum, now we're going to bring up that bottom end here. So we're at about 140 hertz, 141 hertz here. We're doing about a 6 dB boost here at 141 hertz. So on the bottom end here, trying to bring up some of that weight and emphasize the fundamental. You'll notice here on the frequency analyzer when I hit play, we're boosting slightly underneath the fundamental. So now that we've controlled the bottom end and we've controlled the dynamics of our snare drum with our EQ and our compressor, now we can boost up a little bit below the fundamental and actually bring up some of that sub area as well, which is going to make our snare drum feel nice and powerful as the drummer hits it. So take a listen here without, and then I'll kick this boost in. You can hear how much weight we're getting from this boost here in the bottom end of the snare drum. So by boosting slightly below the fundamental here, we bring up some of that bottom end underneath the fundamental on our snare drum, and we really help it feel full in the bottom end here. Now, the last piece of the puzzle here is I did throw on one more limiter at the end here, just to make sure bringing up this bottom end boost didn't drastically change the dynamics of our snare drum. I want it to be full range, but I also want it to be consistent here inside the track. I don't want to hear a lot of bottom end on one hit, and then suddenly it sounds thin on the next hit because it drops in volume or something like that. So take a listen here, and you can see we're not doing much reduction, maybe a dB here with our last limiter. Just 1 or 2 dB, and it gives us that extra level of control so we can park the snare drum exactly where we want it in the drum mix and in the track as a whole here. So let's throw it in with the rest of the drums, and I'll A-B all of our processing here on the snare drum. So initially, as we were listening through to just the isolated snare drum, as I A-B'd the processing, it felt like without the processing, the snare drum was quite a bit fatter and it had more bottom end to it. But once we stick it in with the rest of the drums, all of the focusing we've done, all of the EQ and compression we've done to park the snare drum where we want it, makes it feel bigger inside the drum mix. So let's throw it in with the rest of the track now, and I'll do the same thing. I'll A-B our processing. You can hear our snare drum in the mix as a whole.
Me centered, keeps me in this place, 'cause your love is more than I could ever ask. It's my love that keeps me centered, keeps me in this place, 'cause your love
what we're doing here to get a fat sounding snare drum is we're doing evening and we're doing controlling here. So a little bit of evening here with our first limiter. Then we're coming in and we're controlling that bottom end, taming any ringing, using our compressor to even out the volume and tighten up our snare drum sound. Before we come back, we boost that top end to get that sizzle, and we boost that bottom end to bring out that weight and that impact. And then one more level of evening here with our last limiter to make sure every hit is consistent here on the snare drum. I hope that was helpful for you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're ready to go a little bit deeper into the drum mixing process, then definitely check out the link in the description for my 3-step framework for mixing drums workshop. This is a completely free workshop that will help you dial in a repeatable workflow for cranking out professional sounding drum mixes right from your home studio. Thank you so much for watching here today, and I will see you in the next video.